a Canadian radio sanctuary podcast.
I guess my earliest memories growing up include trains, because we always had the distant sound. Growing up in Burnaby, we had the distant sound of trains down on the Marine Drive area. There's the BC Railway, or the Southern Railway tracks down there, and also the CP and CN trains and so on. So those were always there, but I think I was maybe 8 years old when what formed my foundation kind of clicked into place with the wonderful Gogi Grant hit, The Wayward Wind. And there is a line in there that says, "And I guess the sound of the outward bound made him a slave to his wandering ways." Well, I just loved the notion of the distant whistle, and there were whistles in those days. It was 1956, and so we still had steam in Canada, and there was some diesel. So there were steam whistles, there were diesel horns, and so on. And so I go back to my early childhood, and that was when I was captivated by that faraway sound, and I still love that sound. In the middle of the night here in Mission, which is a train town, there are trains going through Mission, there are trains going across the bridge, there are trains on the south side of the valley, and when I hear those train horns in the middle of the night, I just smile, because they just sound so beautiful. And so it's been a 60-year love affair so far with trains.
So what brings you to the book? How did that all come about?
We had a very successful book with Slumax Gold with Heritage House. And that's now, as of today, 11,000 plus copies sold. And a bestseller in Canada is 5,000. So we've more than doubled that with Slumax Gold. So the folks at Heritage House said, "Do you have any other books?" And we said, "Well, what would you like us to write about?" And they said, "We don't have a train book." And so we started to think about what we might do, and we thought, there are so many stories in British Columbia, and then if we expanded it to Alberta, so we made it a kind of a Western Canada story, we'd get that much more. And so we said, let's look into it, and we came back after a short while and said, yeah, we can do this. So thus came the genesis of the book. We each took about a third of the writing responsibility. And so there's, I don't know, maybe 36 stories or something like that in here. And we went after it. And it evolved and came to be what it is today. And it, too, is on the bestsellers list. We now have 12 weeks totted up on the bestsellers list so far.
The local Lower Mainland and Fraser Valley, the interurban line that used to run through here.
Yeah.
I remember as a kid in the 50s riding with my mom.
Yes,
on
me
that.
too. Yeah. And we have a story on that, as a matter of fact. So CP was first, and they came down the north side of the river, and then Canadian National, which was actually a compilation of a number of other railways, came down the south side of the river, and each in its own way had to cross the river back and forth and so on. And then the interurban came to pass, and that was first Vancouver to Richmond, Vancouver to New Westminster, and then they moved New Westminster out to Chilliwack. And then in the late 1950s, that disappeared. And of course, it's one of the conspiracy theories that you hear from time to time. Did GM, wanting to sell buses, undercut the whole interurban railway market here, as they did supposedly in Los Angeles, as they did across North America and so on, in order to sell their buses? Well, that becomes part of urban mythery and so on, so we have to leave that there. But in actual fact, what did happen was by the late 1950s, the interurban stopped running. Today, the Southern Railway of British Columbia follows much of that routing, and they in fact have a couple of trains that come out every day, and they run from, I think some trains go as far as Chilliwack to deliver goods and so on. But they run from New Westminster through Surrey and everything out to Abbotsford, to Huntington, in fact. And so that still follows much of the same route as the interurban railway did. And there are people who want the interurban to be reinvigorated and come back. We had some demonstration lines in recent years. Certainly Expo 86, they ran a train from Abbotsford every day into the Expo site to prove that it could be done. And they had to coexist with the people who have the right-of-way these days, which is Southern Railway and so on, but they did it. And there's a group called Rail for the Valley, which is trying to get that whole concept brought up. And they say, okay, the West Coast Express on the north side of the river, and a lot of people from the south side of the river come over to Mission or over to Haney and pick up the train and go into Vancouver. Why not invigorate it or reinvigorate it, reanimate it, I suppose, south of the river? So who knows if that will come to pass or not. And, of course, like rail transit, the concept of expanding things in Surrey and so on. They say they're going to do it on their own. Maybe, maybe not. Who knows?
Now, in Europe, rail travel is more common, is it not?
Very. As a matter of fact, the way we use buses, they use trains. And if you use London as an example, you can literally hop on a train in, I don't know how many stations they have, but I'm thinking of Liverpool, Victoria, Euston, St. Pancras, King's Cross. All of these stations are all situated around London, and you can go north to Edmonton, Glasgow to the Midlands. You can go west. Paddington Station's another one. West all the way out to the West Country. South, people use trains like they use the underground in London. They use the trains to get to various different parts of the country. Well, then in France, you have the TGV, the Très Grande Vitesse, which is the high-speed train. And that can actually start in St. Pancras, go through the Channel all the way to Paris. But then they have trains that go all the way over Europe and so on that are all high-speed. We're booking into a trip to Italy this year, which will largely involve train travel in Italy. Germany, the same thing. So the trains are just a way of life there. Rapid transit only on a larger scale. Rather than just a city, we're talking all of Europe. Mm-hmm. Lots of rapid transit.
British Columbia, then you have Alberta, Yukon. Is there a link from Alberta to the Yukon, or is it cut through BC and up?
The story that we have for Yukon is, of course, the White Pass and Yukon Railroad. Mm-hmm. And so that picks up in Alaska, goes off into Dawson City and things like that. And we talk about here the Bard of the North, Robert Service, arriving via that rail service. And today it's a tourist service, right? So people will get off I believe it's Ketchikan is the western terminus. So they'll get off a cruise ship in Ketchikan, and then they'll take the White Pass and Yukon into Yukon and so on. But I don't believe there's a direct link. There are CN tracks that go off into the Prince Rupert area and so on, but I don't believe there's any direct link into the Yukon.
Now, the Rocky Mountaineer, when you hear that, one tends to think of this wonderful train that goes from Vancouver through the Rockies and so on, and is for tourism. Now, is there a little background on that you can give us on the history of that?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a whole chapter in our book on that and what came to make that. The Via Rail folks had not kept up passenger service. They had given over to freight and so on. Very infrequent passenger service here. There's still lots back east. And so the visionaries who saw the possibility for the Rocky Mountaineer said, if we drove a daylight train, so we'll stop in Kamloops, we'll stop in Calgary and whatever, we will stop in Alberta, but all our travel will be at day. So if you go to Kamloops, overnight in Kamloops, then you're traveling through the Rockies during the day. And previous trains had not done that. They basically went through much of the Rockies at night. And so the grandeur, the huge tourism appeal is not necessarily there if you're traveling overnight. It's nice to say we're passing Mount Robson, but looking out the window, you can't really see it. So to do that during the day is stunning. And so they realized that the potential to make this a world-class trip so that you could see the Rockies during the day was there. And so they built it, and it's hugely successful. They have traffic from literally all over the world, but a lot of it is from the Orient, from Japan, from China, and so on. People who come here, and they're thrilled about going through the Rockies. They don't have anything like that over there. I mean, you have Mount Fuji, but really that's it. They don't have the mountain ranges that we have.
Are there people who have been involved in trains in some way who may never have worked with the railway in any way? I mean, there are a lot of train fans out there, like yourself.
Rail fans, you bet.
Rail fans. Do you run into them all the time?
I talk to people all the time, and as I'm doing presentations and so on for this book in libraries and things like that, people come up to me and, I've been a rail fan forever. Doing the research, I ran into some very interesting people. One guy showed me, and he's actually, there's a story recounting some of his exploits here, but I went to talk with him, and he showed me a long piece of material. It would be 11 and a half inches, or 11 inches wide, I guess, but long. It must have been 3 feet. It was a schedule that went, that showed the daily progress on the Kettle Valley Railway of their various different trains. And every stop was initial. It was almost like a logbook of, only done by train masters and so on, to maintain the schedule. And this guy he gave me so much wonderful information. He used to work in the railroad. He now is a railroad aficionado and has all sorts of information on it. So there's that aspect. People who used to work on the rails, and they know and understand what's going on. But then there are people who just love trains. And we have train spotting here in Canada, just as much as we have train spotting over in the UK and things like that. The famous movie, which was built around that concept. People love to see trains. And the diehard folks will take their logbook and they will note the train engines. And of course every locomotive has an engine or has an engine number, and so they'll note that and so on, so that they can say, oh yeah, well I saw number 4663 or whatever it is going through town, and to them that's a mark of achievement. All over North America there are train viewing platforms, and in high traffic areas, especially high traffic areas where they might have dozens of trains a day, there will be a 1 or 2 story viewing platform, covered, open, and people will come and they'll sit there. There'll be maybe a radio which gives you the local traffic. So if engineers are coming across a bridge or coming down a cut or whatever, and they'll say approaching such and such, da-da-da-da. So they're doing their communication thing. You can listen to them and you say, okay, the train will be here in 3 minutes. And then you line up with your camera, and as it goes by, you can take a shot of it. Living in Mission, which is a train town, we have the bridge, we have the Y, we have CNCP, we have West Coast Express. We have actually about half a dozen railroads that go here, through here from time to time. During the summer, we have VIA, and we have the Rocky Mountaineer and so on. And sometimes the Southern Railway comes up here and so on. So there's lots of what they call movements every day. And I say we should have a train viewing platform here. So they're hugely popular in the States. And of course, what happens when those people get hungry? They go into town looking for food. They go into town looking for a bookshop that might have some books on railways and railroad tales, trains, and so on. There's a lot of people with a lot of money who are rail fans. And then beyond that, there's the restoration societies, the people who want to restore. It used to be focused on steam locomotives, and now lots of people are restoring diesel locomotives and some of the electric locomotives in the States that are particularly popular back there. Those things are they're classics because locomotives are everywhere. So there's a lot of rail fans out there.
Now, one of the people that has endorsed your book is former Premier Mike Harcourt, who actually worked on the trains.
He did, yeah. Mayor Mike and Premier Mike and Waiter Mike at one time. Yeah, he was very impressed with the book and so on. So he was happy to give us an endorsement and so on. He'd worked on the railway a lot when he was going to school and things like that. And I've known a number of people who've done that. Heard a funny story. My scoutmaster many years ago, his name was Kent, and he said they would always get asked as they're traveling through the Rockies, the waiters would get asked by somebody, what is the name of that creek? And of course they look down and there's, who knows, it's one of hundreds of creeks that they would go past every day. And so somebody at the next table, he was waiting on a table, somebody at the next table said to the waiter there, what is the name of that creek? And the guy looked out and he said, oh, that's Kent Creek, ma'am. And my scoutmaster is standing next door, and he's Kent. And they just made it up as they went along.
Yeah. That's funny. Now, you're talking about the Rocky Mountaineer, but also some of the restoration of trains and the Royal Hudson. Now, there's a story right there.
You bet. And it's a very personal story. As a matter of fact, in 1972, and I was working at CKNW CFMI, and I was talking to a few people about the concept of establishing a fan train. And I said, maybe we could find an old steam locomotive and we could actually restore it and run it, say, from Vancouver to Chilliwack. Well, most people thought I was crazy. One of the guys who worked at CFMI said, there's an old broken up steam engine sitting underneath the Cambie Street Bridge. Now, this is the old Cambie Street Bridge.
Right.
And he said, you can get into the yards there. It's fairly easy access, the old CP yards. So we went down one Sunday afternoon and we found this old broken up locomotive. And it was literally rusting in place and falling apart. And we looked at it and thought, well, that would be a really neat thing to restore. I looked to the left and I was looking over toward the CP roundhouse that was there. And I saw a huge tender sticking out the back, and it had the number 2860 on it. And I thought, that's a steam tender. That's a big locomotive. So we walked over and went into the roundhouse. We were trespassing on private CP property, but nobody would stop you or anything. We walk in, and there is the Royal Hudson. I had no idea what it was, but it was the Royal Hudson sitting there, again, rusting in place. It had been saved from the scrapyard in the 1950s, brought to Vancouver, and then sat there all that time. So this is maybe 1971, as a guess. Well, we climbed all over that locomotive. We were in the cab and up on the running boards and everything. It's a huge, wonderful locomotive. One day we were there and there was a fellow taking pictures of it. And he was up on the boiler and he was taking a picture of the whistle. And I said, do you have any idea what this locomotive is? And he looked at me and he said, this locomotive? I love this locomotive. And then he told me what it was. It was a Hudson. It was known as the Royal Hudson. Gave me a little bit of history of it and so on. So I suggested that it should be restored, and he said, yes, we're working on that. Well, the next thing you know, the NDP government under Dave Barrett, who was a big rail fan, came into power in 1972, and one of the first things that Dave Barrett did was to say, we're going to restore that locomotive, and we'll run it on the government line, the PGE line at the time, between North Vancouver and Squamish. And so the whole thing was refurbished. Years later, as I was researching various different things and learning about train horns, and there's a chapter in our book on that, I recognized this guy. This is the fellow who was there that day was Bob Swanson, who was responsible for the creation of the O Canada horns in downtown Vancouver. He was responsible for the creation of train horns which are used all over North America, many of which were built for many, many years in Langley, British Columbia. And he was responsible for the restoration and the operation of the Royal Hudson. So yes, there's a huge tale there. It now sits in a wonderful repose. The Railway Museum, the West Coast Railway Museum Park in Squamish. And it's waiting, not restoration so much as a checkup, right? Every so many thousands of hours, you have to have a checkup to make sure that everything's working right, that the boiler is solid and all that. And so the Royal Hudson is at that hourage, and it has to be done. So they're raising money for that to restore it and get it back on the tracks. But meanwhile, you can go to the West Coast Railway Heritage Park and you can see it and touch it. And
in recent years, trains' popularity has been shown through the interest in what they call the Christmas or holiday train that has gone across the country. Well, different stages of it anyway, with performers on it, like Jim Cuddy, for example. Now that in itself is a great promotion of the railway, isn't it?
Oh, you bet. It starts way back east and comes across the country. I've seen it twice in Pitt Meadows, now the last two Christmases. I've seen it go by. And just to see it go by with all the colors and everything is just really, really... I mean, every car has... Well, start with the locomotive, and then every car all the way to the end, and there's probably 10 cars involved. There are sleeping cars, because the performers stay en route, right? So they are there, they stop in a town, they do their thing, and then they move on to the next town, and they might do 3 or 4 shows of a night. So to see it moving along the tracks is really evocative. It's a special time of year. All those lights just it's a wonderful sight to see. But then when they pull into town and they stop, and all of a sudden the doors come down and the stars come out and they start playing songs, and there's Christmas songs and there's other things and so on. It's a wonderful experience. The crowds that show up number in the thousands depending on your location, and so it has huge support. It's a wonderful experience, and I applaud CP for doing that and bringing it across the country.
The book is called Whistle Post West. Brian Antonson is our guest. The book written by Brian along with Rick Antonson and Mary Trainer, and it's a great read, Brian. Thank you.
You're welcome. Woo-hoo!